To the extent that we live our lives in a manner that is consistent with the truth in our heart, we thrive.
Welcome to the Meier Clinics podcast, and you just heard a quote from one of your hosts, Dr. Lisa Day. Join our licensed clinical professionals from various backgrounds as they discuss fascinating mental health topics with a wide range of guests. Meier Clinics is a Christian counseling organization with multiple clinics nationwide dedicated to treating the whole person, emotionally, physically, and spiritually. Welcome to our listening family. We thank you for joining us. Hi, everyone. Kristin Walker here. We're with Dr. Lisa Day, and we are going to be talking about anger, the mask of vulnerability. Hello, Lisa.
Hi, Kristin.
So tell us what the heck the mask of vulnerability has to do with anger.
Absolutely. Well, I guess the reason I wanted to bring this up or talk about it is because so many of us have jerks in our life, right? And we're like, why is that guy such an idiot? Or why is he such a jerk? He's a raging, out of control jerk. And you and I talk so much about, anger and jerks being attached to narcissism, or sociopaths. And I think it's important that we realize that anger also, is associated with other emotions. And I always tell people in my practice that anger is a healthy emotion, right? So we want to be angry, but we want to not be destructive. So be angry, but do not be destructive. And so when I was thinking about people with anger issues, anger management problems, the people who lose their keys and F-bombs are dropping left and right, they trigger us, right? They provoke us to react and to regress into operating in ways that we don't even like to operate. And so the reason I wanted to bring it in with vulnerability would be so that potentially we could look at them differently and approach them differently, which makes a world of difference. And so when I think of anger being the mask of vulnerability, I think it's helpful to take a look at vulnerability. And we all know that Brené Brown has done an amazing job, with research and covering that. But many people are confused with what vulnerability is, right? And, we think about being vulnerable. And when I think about being vulnerable, I think about being transparent, being able to share the totality of who we are, the rawness of who we are, the struggles of who we are. But I think, too, sometimes people get confused with vulnerability as telling you about how my kid is going to react to a post on Facebook, how my kid's reacting to a pending divorce, right? And so I think that there's a difference between vulnerability and oversharing. And when we think of vulnerability in the sense of anger being the mask of vulnerability, we want to think about, can I show my weakness? Can I show my tenderness? Can I show my humanness? And you hear me talk about authentic self or the higher self or the true self.
Yep.
And so many times, we're guided by the book of shoulds written by they say we should operate, in this manner or share these emotions. And I find that, if we're being vulnerable, and you and I, Kristin, are vulnerable with each other, I think all the time, we're sharing transparency, such as I'm having a tough time today, or I'm not on top of the game. Extending that grace to ourselves and being able to be honest, with those around us. This morning, I was doing a crazy thing, and I was climbing the mountain here in Sun Valley. Sometimes we go uphill, not downhill, on skis. And I was skiing with some pretty, strong women. And it struck me that, I was trying to keep up with them all that I had. I'm fairly convinced that I was going to have a massive heart attack or my pancreas was going to pop up. And it struck me, what is vulnerability? Vulnerability is embracing that I'm not at that level and that it's okay. And I said, you know what, guys, I'm going to drop back just a pace because this is what's more comfortable for me. And I think that many of us don't have that ability. We're going to push through it, or we're going to blame shift to, I've got a knee problem, or you guys are going too fast, or you guys are trying to ditch me. And so vulnerability, I just think of transparency.
Agreed. And I can give a real world example. I was doing a telephone call with someone who really didn't know the material that they were talking about with me. And this person kind of tends to blame everybody else for when they don't really know something. And that same thing came up with, you're not engaging enough, Kristin. I'm having to carry the whole weight of this conversation. You're not getting it. And, that's a lack of vulnerability on their part because they were insecure. This is new
Yeah.
information for them. And I was thinking to myself, I can't put this information out there because they're not confident in what they're saying, but how do I say this in a way that isn't shaming or, there's all those things. So I opted to just say, I don't think you're very comfortable with the material, and I'll be more comfortable asking you questions when you're more confident about delivering it.
Nice. So good boundary.
Right.
Good boundary. Well, and I think that you touched on something there that is so very important, because if we think about transparency of really just basically showing up and being seen, the good, the bad, the ugly, strengths and the weaknesses.
Yep.
What inhibits that, or what gets in the way of that, is that people are oftentimes terrified, about what other people might see, or what they might say. And, one of the major challenges, if you will, in being vulnerable, and which is what we see related to anger, is the whole concept of shame. That, if one has grown up in a dynamic where they've been judged and criticized or controlled, and they have any residual shame, it's not safe to be vulnerable. It's not safe to be transparent, because, we talk about shame often, and we talk about guilt as being that you've done something bad, but shame is that you are bad. And, so for folks who have difficulty with vulnerability, it's often because they struggle with shame. That to have said to that person that I'd like to invite you to become more familiar with your material before we do this podcast, someone who struggles with shame, they're going to, react toward you.
Right.
Who are you to tell me what to do on my podcast? And,
right.
I'm the expert here. So I think that, looking at when we think about anger, in masking fears, oftentimes the greatest fear that it's masking not only is the vulnerable emotion, not only is it anxiety, but it's shame, it's shame and guilt.
Exactly. And if you think about, because, this comes up, especially around the holidays, where things get tight financially for people. And sometimes you'll say yes to things that because you feel desperate, you feel cornered. And that adds its whole other level of shame and all, everything to do with that. And so what I've found, especially being an entrepreneur, how many times have I had, oh my gosh, how am I going to make it moments? I've found as I've gotten older, it's so much easier for me to ask for help, or to say to someone, you know what, I'm really feeling extra emotional or extra scared or extra whatever because, nobody wants to pay their bills over the holidays because they're buying Christmas presents.
Right. Right.
And just the act of doing that gives yourself grace, because we tend to hold everything all in because we don't want people to know that we're not perfect, when the reality is the minute that you start sharing. I mean, for me, it was people went, oh yeah, me too. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. And then I had a comrade in arms, instead of me making all these judgments about how someone's treating me because I am making up stories in my head.
Well, and I think that we're so afraid of appearing bad or wrong or out of sorts. I shared with you before we got started here that I just had an eye exam, and I went in for my eye exam, and I was under the impression that it was going to be $65. And I went to check out. They said, okay, that'll be $199, please. And it kind of hit me. I wasn't prepared for $199. But oftentimes we're afraid that people are going to think that we're weird, or we're bad, or we're poor, or we're selfish. And so we just pay the $199. And it was interesting. So in that moment, an example of vulnerability was, I said, I'm sorry, but I don't understand. Can you help me understand? I was under the impression it was going to be $65 today, and I'm not prepared, to pay $190. Can you help me understand? And that is an example of being vulnerable, but it's also in that moment, I've been practicing this stuff for almost 30 years. I thought, oh, Lisa, just pay it, just pay it. Don't be difficult. They're going to think that you're, a penny pincher. And it was interesting, Kristin, because when I did say I wasn't prepared for that, and I wasn't instructed that it would be anything more than 65, they were able to do some dancing there, and they came back and they dropped it in half. And had I not been able to be vulnerable and say, I'm sorry, can you help me understand? This isn't what I was prepared for. I likely wouldn't have got that. But the other thing, it's a good example, because in my mind, I'm thinking, are you kidding me? How did we get from 65 to 190, right? So that anger came up, that I was being victimized, and this is unfair, and you guys are just money diggers. And being able to give ourselves that pause and go, what is this anger? I'm feeling like I'm being violated, but also inside my head, I'm afraid of feeling foolish to inquire about this. And so it comes up all the time,
And the flip side, here's another one. The flip side of that is I have people that will come to me and they don't really understand what it is I do, and that it actually costs money to, run a network and all this stuff. And sometimes it's a naivete that they don't know that they have to pay for something. And sometimes it's that they want something for free. And I have to decipher what the heck's going on here. But I have found this: the people that really their intention is they want something for free and they feel entitled to have, something that I would have to pay money for, that they want for free, and they feel entitled to it. When you say no, those people get angry. When you tell someone that just is naive and they just don't know, they tend to go to, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. And they're embarrassed. Not that I want people to be embarrassed, but you can tell by people's reactions, aha, thank you for just, that anger right there. That lets me know that you probably are not someone that I would want to be involved with anyway.
Absolutely. And whereas the other person is being vulnerable, they're embarrassed to be able to say, oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't think through that, or I didn't realize that was the case.
Exactly.
Yeah. And when we think about rageful people, because I think we've all, notoriously, when I do a speaking engagement, people will say to me, how do I deal with this jerk or that jerk in my life? And I'll say, why would I want to teach you how to deal with a jerk? And sometimes, that's funny and it ends there, but really that's what I want to talk about here today, is how do we deal with that jerk? Because if we can begin to see angry, rageful, explosive people, and I'm talking to people who throw their keys or, very short fused with themselves, so they're uttering profanities in the house, and everybody starts to walk on eggshells. But then once they found their keys, they move right by. Okay, let's go to the park. And, and so it's what underlines so much of that is a long history, of during their developmental years, not being safe to be wrong, not being safe to not be on time, not being safe to screw up something. And really, instead of saying, sweetheart, I want you to be aware of where you put your ski boots so that when it's time to get them, you will bring them back, versus what kind of idiot doesn't know where they put their ski boots.
Right.
And so, when we're parenting and when we're with people and even our colleagues and friends and family, instead of saying you are absolutely amazing and brilliant, to be able to say, you really put some effort into that. And that presentation was really phenomenal. The work that you put and the information that you shared, meaning we're highlighting what the person did versus who the person is. And reason being is because if the person doesn't show up in that regard, they're likely to fall into this whole shame dynamic. When we have vulnerability, and when we have anger being the mask of vulnerability, I think it's important to look at, there's at least 3 different styles, of where we're going to see anger. And ideally, we're all going to have assertive anger, whereas we're able to see, as you did, in those examples, your business examples, that, oh, I'm angry, which is usually an indication that our boundary is being crossed or not being respected.
Right.
And then we're able to communicate a need, so I think ideally we all want to be able to use anger as that, red light on our engine, that something is wrong that needs to be addressed, and then to find a way to communicate our needs, with regard to that anger. But the 2 forms of anger that we're more likely to see when one is struggling with vulnerability, first and foremost, is the passive aggressive behavior. Kristin, why wouldn't you give me this show for free? How can you charge for it? It's a mental health show. Isn't it for the benefit of people? Why would you charge for this?
Oh yeah. Or I'm so well known and I'm such a superstar that, you should just be grateful that, you're going to get attention from me by being a part of your network. You have no idea how many people I've heard that from.
or when you do confront them, they pretend that everything is fine. Mm-hmm. When you say, no, I'm not willing to do that, they absolutely ignore it. And they say, are we going to record on Tuesday? Are we still going to meet? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And we talk about passive aggressive behavior as being, certainly something that we see with narcissism and something that we see with unhealthy people. But that form of anger oftentimes is, again, an attempt to deal with that sense of vulnerability, that fear of being out of control, or that fear of being rejected or abandoned. And then the third way we see anger, of course, is just in that flat out rageful aggressive, whether it's verbally aggressive or physically aggressive or emotionally aggressive. It's that person that we walk on eggshells. And when we look at vulnerability, and we look at the mask of vulnerability, I try to teach my clients, and this is difficult. The closer the proximity that individual is to us, the more likely is they're going to poke us and we're going to react. And I teach, the most basic boundary with self is the gap. It's the space between me and what comes out of my mouth, in response to anything that comes before me. And I teach that if we can look at anger and those who are close to us, as the sign that something else is going on, and we can maintain our separateness, much easier said than done, then we often can provide that safety for that person, to then find, that vulnerability.
Right.
Hi, this is Dr. Paul Meier of the Meier Clinics. Our Christian counselors across the country have a goal of helping all those who come to us to become what God has called them to be. If you're in a situation where you're not at peace within yourself, or you just feel like there's joy that's missing in your life, we can come alongside to help you obtain peace and joy.
This message is sponsored by the Meier Clinic Foundation, a nonprofit Christian counseling ministry. The number is 1-888-7-CLINIC, 1-888-7-CLINIC.
The other day my daughter was getting in her car, and granted, this is a very old car that has a slow leak in the oil. And so sometimes it sounds like chitty chitty bang bang. And she said, "Oh, Mom, the car sounds like the engine's going to blow up." She was getting ready to go to work early. And I said, "Well, sweetheart, have you checked the oil?" "Of course I've checked the oil." And I said, and I didn't think she had. And I said, "Well, sweetheart, I really want you to check the oil, because if the oil goes low, obviously the engine block will crack." And she fired back on me, "It's because you bought me a lousy car, Mom."
Right.
So that's close proximity, right? I wanted to fire back up, "You ungrateful, you don't appreciate." It stirred my anger, right? And that self-preservation. And so if we can give ourselves that gap, I thought, okay, where's my gap between me and what's going to come out of my mouth? And what is she telling me? Follow me, or what's going on with her? And so I chose not to respond. And instead I said, "Would you like me to turn it on so it can heat up before you take off?" And then she was able to soften right out and say, "Yeah, Mom, thank you. I get concerned that it needs to be heated up before we drive in the snow." But we get pulled right into that anger, which is why I'm really wanting to talk to it today. Yeah, and we begin to operate in a way that is inconsistent with who we want to be. Our higher self, or our authentic self.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And boy, is it hard with kids and family not to go right into that anger.
Well, the closer the proximity of the relationship, the more easily we are provoked.
Yes.
Follow me? So if someone on the street, yells at me, I might think, wow, they've had a bad day. But if my, family member says, well, if you really cared, you would provide X, Y, and Z.
Right.
It insults me, and I want to come back with, it gets the fight or flight response, right? Our cortisol gets triggered, and we want to either fight or bail. And so, being aware of that in ourselves, and then choosing not to fire that, and instead to hold space, and to inquire, how can I be here for you, or what's going on? It sounds like this is something that you really want to do, and you're frustrated that perhaps you can't afford it, or you can't make it happen. Takes a great deal of separateness.
It does. It does. And I think too, getting to a place and, not close proximity, but, with a colleague or with someone that wanted to be a colleague, or maybe was trying to carve out a friendship with you or whatever, and you just know that it isn't going to work. You don't have to, I think, especially women, we tend to want to explain everything to death.
Oh, right.
And well, they need to understand why I'm not. No, they don't. No. As you get older, you start to realize, I don't need to explain. I'm not going to be rude, but I really don't need to explain, especially when I've said what's going on, honestly and openly, and it was completely ignored. You can just walk away, and, it's their responsibility for not wanting to hear you. So we can just cut out a lot of our frustration by just going, as soon as you start writing that encyclopedia in your head, go, okay, well, that was a good exercise and I'm not going to share that.
Well, yeah, and that's what I teach with boundaries. We don't defend or explain.
Exactly.
But that being said, the closer the proximity, the more likely we are to defend or explain. So, sweetheart, I'm not going to be home to let the dogs out this morning because I'm, going to skin the mountain, versus I'm not
Right.
going to be home to let the dogs out. But I think that, and I think that we want to look at anger when it's covering up vulnerabilities. It can show up in a couple of different ways. And the reason I just want to share these is so that we can look for that. And I'm not saying at all that we want to be a doormat and that we want to tolerate abusive behavior. But if we can keep ourselves from reacting to it and throwing fuel to the fire, oftentimes we can find that safety in relationship for a person to be able to
Yes.
move beyond the anger. And one of the ways when people respond with anger to vulnerability, it's their attempt to cover up their hurt. So if we've done something, or if something has happened to them that they feel hurt by, they're going to, that boss is such a jerk. I can't even believe it. He's so hard on me. Well, it may be that they're hurt because they were given some feedback. The individual's given some feedback of their
Right.
performance on the job, or that embarrassment. So, one of the things we want to look for is that mask, or is that anger an attempt to cover up hurt? The other thing
Right.
we can see is that when people get anxious, or they're tense on the inside, feeling anxious, insecure, or if they're worrying, instead of saying I'm really concerned about what the outcome is going to be here, I think about medical results, right? So someone's getting a colonoscopy and they've got some symptoms that make them concerning. Are you concerned about going in for your exam? No, I'm not concerned. Things are as they're going to be. And it's the attempt to soothe or stay away from their own inner tension, their own inner anxiety.
Absolutely.
The,
Absolutely.
and then this one I think we see all the time is that, anger can mask fears of emotional intimacy, to mask that you matter to me, or that I'm upset that you had to cancel our lunch date because I really was looking forward to it, instead of, being able to say even to self or the other party, oh, I feel sad. I was very much looking forward to. It can be met with, you always let me down. You just really.
Yeah. I think too, letting yourself be upset about something, we just sort of move on and stuff things down, and taking a moment when you are on the receiving end of something that hurt your feelings and going, ooh, I feel really uncomfortable. I'm not going to go eat or drink or busy myself with, I'm just going to really feel sad for a minute, maybe even have a cry for a minute.
And that is so huge. That's, in some of the readings, and most people are familiar with Brené Brown. She really talks about that vulnerability. Some people think that vulnerability is a sign of weakness,
Right.
and it causes us to act in manners that are really not true to us. And that's exactly what she points to. It's actually the opposite. When we're not able to embrace our vulnerability and we are not able to be vulnerable in relationships, it actually triggers our dysfunctions. It triggers
Yes.
eating and drinking and shopping and rage.
Right. And just jumping into 12 other projects. So we're constantly busy and never sit down to have to sit with our emotions. I think too, you have to be careful too who you share it with, because also sharing with friends or, people that you can share this with. I noticed this when I share things with my female friends, they're like, oh yeah, I really get that. I felt that way too. Yeah, that wasn't right. Or, whatever it may be. But with my guy friends, you have to remember this isn't across the board, of course, but I have noticed with them, they want to fix the problem I'm presenting,
Yes.
Well, maybe if you did this, and maybe if you did, like, I haven't even finished what I'm trying to say happened before they're telling me how, if I tried this, this, and this, to fix it, or well, remember, or they'll bring up things. Remember when you made that mistake, blah, 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 with that other place. Well, if you just implemented that wouldn't happen to you anymore. And I used to get very angry. I remember I got so angry and hurt, and all the things you're saying, Lisa, from my childhood would come up about not being heard and not being heard by my father. All of that was running around inside me in an adult person's body. And now I know what that is. They love me just as much as my female friends. It's just, that's kind of, men are trained to be that way. So I don't even get angry. They say what they need to say. I let it go. And I don't allow myself to sit later and go, man, and have, conversations with them that they're not a part of in my head. They just keep bringing up these mistakes, blah, blah. I can just let it go because I know that they're not thinking about it. And I know
Well,
anything negative by it. And I can also say, hey, later, hey, I don't need you to fix anything. I just need you to hear me.
well, I think you point to a couple of things in there is that, when you did take the risk to be vulnerable, that you feel worse because they're trying to fix it. When someone's trying to fix us, we really feel broken, right?
Yes.
We may not have felt broken coming into it, but we sure do now.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so, just, so sometimes you handle it pretty gracefully, but some of us are like, screw that. I'm not going to be vulnerable again, or screw you. I'm not going to talk to you. And if there's one thing that I teach more than I think anything in my practice, and I think I've shared it with you before, and it's corny, and I say it, I would put it right in my back pocket. And it's this: feelings, facts, needs. Feelings, facts, needs.
Right.
And it's just an outline that we look at. What am I feeling as it relates to this situation? And what specifically do I need? And then I say, Kristin, with men, we turn it around. So we don't start with our feelings or the facts with men. We start with the need. And then we share. So I gave that example of climbing the mountain this morning before I came into work, and I was with my girlfriends. But had I been with a man, I would say, I need you to assure me to go slow and steady because I'm feeling intimidated by the fact that this is really steep. Okay. Whereas if I said, oh boy, I'm feeling intimidated by the fact that this is really steep, he's going to go, just go slow and steady, slow and steady. And somehow, when we do the feeling, fact, need, and we're able to be vulnerable with our need, we experience that as love and nurturing. But when we're given the unsolicited advice, we hear that as, I'm an idiot and I don't know how to do this. And so it's a fine shift. It's a fine-tuned shift of how to bring that vulnerability. And so I think that, I sometimes say, well, I don't sometimes say, I say quite often, do not share a feeling unless you know what it is you need, because you set yourself up for risk.
Yes. I will. Oh man, I'm going to change up. You always learn. I've known my ex-husband for 33 years. He's the biggest culprit of what I just talked about. And you're right. But he's so caring. He gets upset because he cares. He doesn't want anyone to hurt me. He's like, I just want to throat punch that person. Okay, we don't need to get to violence now. Let's work on your anger. But now I know I can, thank you for the reminder. I can start with the need first.
And we have to. I mean, currently in our valley and the mountain life, we have a cougar problem. We have a four-legged cougar problem. And which means
good clarification.
The other one we can address in another podcast. But we have to take our dogs if it's dawn or dusk. You can't let your dogs out to go potty in the backyard. You have to take them out on a leash because several dogs, unfortunately, have been killed. Many dogs, unfortunately, this year have been killed. And so sometimes I get really frustrated. It's the middle of the night. It's freezing. It's 2 degrees. I have to put on a coat and snow boots and a leash and walk out and go potty, go potty. Come on, go potty. Right. And so when I share, that with my family members, if I just were to share that, they would say, well, you have to do that because there's cougars out there. Whereas if we're going to do the feeling, fact, need, we women, 90% of the time, we need acknowledgement, affirmation, acknowledgement, affirmation, and to be validated. And so I will say, I just need you to affirm that it's frustrating with the cougar problem, that it's frustrating that the dogs can't go out, that it's difficult. It makes parenting our dogs a little more complicated. And I'll just say, I say it this way, I just need you to remind me that it is more work and it is difficult to do it in the middle of the night. And my friends and family are going to say, oh yeah, no, that's a whole level of work and challenge. Whereas if I just say, oh, I'm so frustrated getting up in the middle of the night and taking them out on leashes, again, I'm going to say you should do that. So when we do feeling, fact, need, and when we share the need, it just increases the likelihood that whatever vulnerability we're bringing up, it's going to be nurtured. It's going to be met. So when we are building vulnerability in our own position, feeling, fact, need helps. But also when we're on the receiving end of those who mask their vulnerability with anger, when it's met at us with anger, to be able to come alongside and say, how can I be here? What do you need? I can see you're
Yeah.
frustrated.
Yeah. Absolutely.
That's
Absolutely.
our short message.
Well, thank you, Dr. Lisa Day.
Thank you, Kristin.
Thank you, listeners, for another terrific episode on Meier Clinics podcast. We hope you enjoyed this podcast. Tune in next time for another engaging discussion on relevant mental health topics. If you have any questions about Meier Clinics, please visit our website at meierclinics.com. That's MEIER clinics.com, or call us at 888-7-CLINIC. Don't forget to leave us a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or any of your favorite podcast apps. And please note that we are a member of and produced by Mental Health News Radio Network, MHNRnetwork.com.